So that was a perfect segue into what I'm going to be touching on, and thank you for your comment as a parent. So we'll come back to that. So my intention here is to briefly go over the diversity of how cerebral palsy presents, what neuropsychology has contributed to our understanding of the disorder, and talk a little bit about some resources that are available. Dr. Ward has gone over a lot of these early slides that I have here, so to just kind of graze through these. Cerebral palsy really has initially been conceptualized as a disorder of motor movement, and it's quite diverse in how it presents, as Dr. Ward touched on, and a lot of that does have to do with where the insult or injury is in the context of the connectivity in the brain with the white matter. But increasingly what we have come to realize is that the type of injury and the extent of the injury really does affect not only our understanding of how motor movement is impacted, but also broader kind of cognitive implications, social emotional implications. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, there is a lot of different types of injuries, types of insults that an individual could present with. Certainly, the periventricular leukomalacia is the most common presentation of what we see in terms of injury and sort of brain difference in individuals with cerebral palsy. Bax is has done a tremendous job with collecting data and information to inform our understanding of how cerebral palsy presents and what really the diversity is. Increasingly, what we are coming to appreciate is what those non-motor components of cerebral palsy really are, and how do we intervene and support individuals to really promote independency and resiliency. We talked a little bit about the condition as being static, non-progressive. I would say that is a term that we use in differentiating how cerebral palsy is from, for example, cancer, where a tumor might be growing and impacting, kind of encroaching on different brain regions. This does not mean that the disability does not change, does not further impact functioning and outcomes. I would say a conversation that I often have with families is where we're doing, repeated neuropsychological evaluations over the course of the child's life, and we're seeing children or individuals kind of grow into deficits, so to speak. And so in that context, we need to continue to update intervention programming, educational planning, and really our expectations for how to support, again, that and build that independence and that resiliency. So ongoing monitoring, ongoing programming is really, really important. And so, in the same way, I think when we think about any child, and particularly children with disabilities, it's really important to take a holistic approach, a holistic perspective, considering not only biologically, sort of structurally what is going on, but what have the opportunities been to promote learning. And then what is the environment like? What is the environment like at home? What is the environment like at school? What is the environment like out in the community? How many opportunities does this individual have really to learn and to develop those skills? And how is that being fostered? And, at the core of that, too, what we're talking about is mental health and how that all kind of brings it together. I want to briefly go over what we often see are some common neurocognitive presentations and profiles in individuals with cerebral palsy. It is a presentation where oftentimes, not always, but often we see when there is more motor impairment, there's also some more cognitive difficulties that the individual experiences. And yes, there certainly are some structural explanations for that. There are some biological explanations for that. But as Dr. Ward kind of alluded to, when there is less of an opportunity to explore one's environment because one is more physically restricted, it's harder to learn. So then, and our brain develops through learning and kind of exercising that muscle. So a lot of those, not only where there might be some poor connectivity, for example, in those different parts of the brain, like the parietal lobe, as Dr. Ward talked about, then there's less of an opportunity to continue to kind of grow that muscle and grow those abilities and those skills, and that can make it then just that much more difficult for the individual to keep up with peers. You know, as we talked about, language is something that is often preserved. The brain's an incredible organ. It does almost everything it possibly can to preserve language, because that's a pretty critical way that we communicate. So often reorganization will happen. For individuals with cerebral palsy, you know, we often see memory being intact as well. It very much depends on where the injury is and what the ultimate presentation is. But those are areas that we often see as being pretty intact, and those we can very readily build off of and kind of support those strengths. Often what we do see, though, are some substantial difficulties with visual, perceptual, understanding, recognition, and that can look like impacting writing skills, that can look like impacting math skills, and that certainly, you know, when we think about what is required for driving and understanding how to park a car in a parking space, kind of thinking about understanding how much we can anticipate the space that we have and then move into that space. So providing, and I certainly would agree that occupational therapy is one of the most tremendous and powerful interventions that we can offer families and kids with this these visual spatial difficulties. You know, and it additionally, we often see attention issues and something called executive dysfunction happening. Those executive functioning abilities are much more located in the front part of the brain, and if we are seeing some brain differences, some disorder going on in sort of the center of the brain, right? That's where we saw those ventricles located. That's where we saw a lot of that white matter disruption happening. Then that front part of the brain is really going to take a hit. So it's going to be harder to plan ahead, to know where to start with something, know how to finish something. You know, even consistently have the motivation or the interest or the desire to follow through, and also advocate for oneself. I think that is something that individuals often struggle with, and then they're seen as lazy or as being kind of naughty, and that's not, that's kind of missing the fact that there are some brain differences that we need to figure out how to meet these individuals where they're at. So again, kind of coming back to taking this very holistic approach in how we're working with individuals and having care provided in the context of multidisciplinary clinics too, where we are including physicians, where we're including OT, PT, social work, psychology, really can be quite powerful. So this, you know, in thinking about what those profiles look like, what the neurocognitive profiles often look like. We have over time developed a specific name sort of for what these profiles are. And again, to kind of just go to then how do we intervene for these individuals, this profile has not been formally documented in the DSM, for example, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is used as sort of a Bible for psychology, for psychiatry, and really helps to facilitate service delivery ultimately. So this nonverbal learning disability, or NVLD, NLD, really does capture the fact that these individuals have trouble with the visual perceptual integration, visual perceptual understanding and processing, which is very much related to that dorsal stream that we were talking about, kind of that top connection. Difficulty with kind of psychomotor movements, and then some difficulties with learning, and then also some social awkwardness, some kind of social clumsiness that can sometimes look like some mild symptoms of almost autism at times. So difficulty, maintaining friends, starting friendships, keeping friendships. So all of that is really captured in this NVLD, NLD profile. What we know helps is, especially for children who are school age, so elementary school, middle school, high school, is really developing a special education program. And then getting connections with outpatient OT, and then having some structured opportunities to really practice some of those social skills. So what is one way that we can sort of facilitate treatment and therapy and support individuals with cerebral palsy? Getting neuropsychological evaluations done is something that has been very useful and helpful for families. The field of neuropsychology is first and foremost founded in psychology, so those of us who are in this practice are clinical psychologists first and foremost, and then we've pursued some additional training in neuroanatomy and medically complicating conditions. The neuropsychological evaluation, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, consists of, it's all paper pencil based, so we don't do any imaging or scans or anything like that. We'll use what physicians obtain, but it's all paper pencil. The amount of testing or the amount of time that it can take can be anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. It could be over the span of 1 day or 2 days. And after the testing, you would get a final report, and we would go over the results with you that you could then share with school. What you can expect in a neuropsychological report is a pretty comprehensive evaluation, a pretty comprehensive overview of what's going on with how the child thinks and learns, and what resources we would recommend that could be helpful to support, again, that independence and that resiliency. When I talk about resiliency, I'm really talking about how do we promote a sense of self-confidence, a sense of self-efficacy. How do we teach that child that when things are hard, they're able to kind of pick themselves up, use their resources, advocate for themselves. So those are common goals, because I think sometimes it can be pretty overwhelming to know where to start or how to get going with resources and services. So kind of just keeping those buckets in mind, I think, can be helpful for families. I do want to note, too, from neuropsychological evaluations, as a field, we're housed in kind of the medical community. And the medical world is different from the educational world, and I'll talk about the educational world in a moment here. And we can talk further at the end of my talk if you have any questions about navigating services or anything like that. But what we see in the testing that we do sometimes is accepted by school, sometimes is not. And if it's not, we can talk about how to kind of navigate advocating for services and getting services set up. But I think it's important to kind of just keep in mind that they're two separate buckets. From a neuropsychological evaluation, we can, and this is a long list of recommendations, but we can get a lot of not only information about how the child learns and how the child retains information and processes the world, but we can get down into some very specific recommendations that could be helpful, that school could be doing, that could be done by parents or caregivers at home. Oftentimes, given a lot of the visual perceptual deficits and difficulties that individuals with cerebral palsy experience, not only including OT, but also providing individuals with the opportunity to use keyboards, to have sort of a modified writing curriculum, and to start teaching talk to text. I don't know how many of you use that in your phones, but it is definitely a skill to develop. It's not something that's necessarily easy to do, because when you do talk and dictate, then you're also having to edit and review what it is that you just dictated. So kind of starting that skill sooner rather than later can be helpful in kind of refining that ability so that individuals aren't having to rely so much on tasks of writing. So I'm going to jump over into special education and just offer some resources with how to navigate services here. There are a few different ways that individuals can receive special education, and myself and my colleagues came up with these slides here to offer to families and providers to just give some guidance here. So a 504 plan is kind of like special education light. There are not dollars attached to it, and it provides accommodations rather than more kind of specific therapies, for example, OT, PT, speech. Certainly with any special education services, passing grades are not guaranteed, and depending on the school district, updating the 504 plan or the special education service will consistently be a part of the process. The schools do have the right to stop a 504 plan at any time or stop special education services at any time if they have determined that the child is making adequate academic progress. Health service plans are often very helpful to have for students with complicating medical conditions. They really do formalize access to nursing staff for children to be able to access the school in a more accessible way, to be able to take medications as needed, to be able to take breaks, and to not have that held against them. So having all of these kind of documented and written down really does make a difference. Oftentimes teachers will give the services out of the goodness of their hearts or because they're, they understand the process or they understand teaching in a way that services a very broad classroom, but sometimes that doesn't happen. So having it documented and formalized can help to kind of make sure that we're reinforcing and reminding those who are working with the students of what the student needs. There's a lot, so when we get to the point of establishing an IEP or an individualized education plan, there's a lot of different types of educational labels. In the medical world, we use, like I said, this big book called the DSM, and that's where ADHD is housed. If we were to move forward with diagnosing an anxiety disorder or depression, autism or a learning disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia. In the educational world, these are the terms that will be used. So while there is some overlap, there's also some differences here. Oftentimes, individuals with cerebral palsy will kind of fall under the other health impairment bucket. Children with ADHD could also fall in that bucket. And then we kind of go from there in terms of tailoring what the plan looks like. In terms of making a referral, doing it in writing is really important. And I would be happy to send this to anyone. We created a mock-up of a letter that can be submitted to school. By submitting the request in writing, that ensures that the school will take the next steps with starting the evaluation or following up with the evaluation. Having a timestamp is really important, because once that written note is received, then that starts the clock with getting services set up. Just having an informal conversation doesn't necessarily get things started. So this written request is really important. Your primary care doc or physician can't kind of write a script or write a note or write in a request for an IEP. It does have to come from the school as to whether or not they decide to establish those services. A physician can certainly help with helping you to construct the letter to send to the school. But just as you're navigating services, I think it's just an important piece to keep in mind. So like I said, there is, by having the written request, it starts the clock and gets services moving. So a school must respond within 15 business days once that request is made. And then the school has 60 calendar days to conduct the evaluation, and then if the student is found eligible for an IEP, they have 30 calendar days to develop an IEP. So you don't need to keep track of all of those numbers, but I just want to kind of drive home the point that there is a clock, and that schools are legally required to follow through in a timely manner with getting services set up. The key for qualifying for services is that the educational performance is adversely affected, so that's a really important part. There sort of needs to be to be some sort of academic difficulty, deficit, failure seen in order for those services to be provided. Should families have difficulty getting services set up, I just want to bring to your attention the fact that there are advocates out there who can help you navigate those services. Again, I would be happy to send any of these numbers or information to families. I think going into a special education meeting, going into school, asking for services, I think it can be quite daunting. It can kind of feel like a few against many. So having someone who can be there, who knows special education law, who can help advocate for families, I think is really, really important. I do also just want to briefly touch on guardianship and reevaluations. From a neuropsychological perspective, we would recommend doing a reevaluation every 3 to 4 years. As Dr. Ward mentioned, we can really start getting pretty substantial information about learning and processing and academic skills at 8 years of age. That's when our batteries really start to develop, and that's very much correlates with how the brain is developing and coming online, and what the expectation is by 8, and what we typically see in terms of how the child is able to process information and learn. Guardianship is often something that families will pursue, and I do just want to note that it's important to start this process before the child's 18th birthday. Neuropsychology is certainly happy to help with this process. Oftentimes, in order to establish guardianship, we need to see some sort of cognitive or neurocognitive deficit and document that. I say often because if there's other complicating factors such as autism, then we're able to kind of go through a different avenue with establishing guardianship. And again, I would be happy to send any of these resources to families to help get that process started, or just to have these available for you to start thinking about. And again, some more resources. I know we have some time today to go over questions. Should you have any more specific questions, or be interested in, think that pursuing a neuropsychological evaluation would be helpful, you can give our clinic a call here. I have our number down here. We also have a fantastic educational resource in our clinic, and would be happy to connect you with her too, if you're receiving services at UW. So I know I'm a little bit over time, but that's about what I had today. I don't know if we have time for questions or if we should wait until the next. Okay.
Do you think if a child gets practice at learning, the brain will get better at learning?
If a child is able to practice more, will the brain get better at learning? I would say the more opportunities that we do have to practice, the more opportunities that there is to engage in community and in school, absolutely. I think that the brain, kind of like any muscle, the more you go to the gym, the stronger you get, the more you have the opportunity to practice and learn, the stronger that brain gets too. Yeah.
A question. You mentioned that children cannot qualify for OT and PT services on a 504 plan. That's not, I see kids on a 504 plan all
You see kids, oh, great, okay.
That's
Great.
actually, so can I just kind of clarify a little bit
Yeah,
of school
yeah.
OT?
Yeah.
504 plans are really about access. It's not special ed light. It's really more about access to regular education. And I love seeing kids on 504 plans because those are my high-flying kiddos who just need some help, some supports and services to make sure that they can access all of their regular education services, whether it's that they need assistive technology or they need, like I just did something to modify a bathroom door in our school district so that the child could access the bathroom. So just to clarify for everybody, if you have a student who has a health impairment or some sort of impairment that impacts their ability to access regular education, those are the kids who qualify for 504 plans, who really can get those school-based OT and PT services. So, and also just, coming into IEP meetings, we never want parents to feel overwhelmed. My kids go to the same school that I work in. I come at it from a parental perspective as well. We don't want families coming in feeling overwhelmed by that IEP team. And I always tell my parents, if you have questions, reach out. I'm there. I had 57 students on my caseload, and I touch base with almost all of my parents at least once every other week. So we really try to make sure that kids are getting equal access to their education, and that parents aren't feeling like they need to come in with an advocate, that we can sit down and talk and be part of the team together, and that if kids aren't qualifying for special ed, if there's an underlying impairment, that we're going to see them for some OT services under a 504 plan. So I hope that helps to clarify.
Yeah, can we send all children to your school?
I think it's the nice thing about working in a smaller rural school district that we get to know our families. And I just called a family yesterday and said, your kid is doing amazing, and it's so fun to see the progress. And we want to have that kind of relationship with families. I don't want families coming in and sitting at that IEP table feeling anxious or nervous. We'd rather be like, hey, how's it going? And what can we do to support your kid?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for bringing this up. I think the range of what schools, school districts, individual schools within districts are able to provide, and having worked in schools for many years myself, I've seen the spectrum of things, and I think it's good to just to reiterate. So schools can, at times, provide these additional OT services, additional PT services, additional speech services under a 504 plan. What it really is about is meeting with the school, figuring out what resources are available and where the school is able to meet you. I love hearing stories about families feeling connected, feeling supported, feeling like there's good home-school communication. That's one of the first questions that I'm asking. And if there's not, certainly it's never the goal to create a more contentious relationship. It's just about figuring out what are the right questions to ask if I'm not getting the services or I'm confused or I'm not sure about. And it's wonderful when there are folks in schools who are really able to take that time. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. No, I think that's wonderful. Yeah.
Please ask those questions about OT and PT services, because we definitely can see kids under a 504 plan. Kids just can't get speech therapy under a 504 plan. That's a separate disability that falls in the category. But OT and PT, most definitely they can. So.
Why is that next to category?
So we have another question over here? Oh, yeah.
It's not a related, it depends on if it's a related service or a service category on its own. If a student qualifies for an IEP under the guise of speech, then that's an area, a qualifying area, OT and PT are a related service. It's a related service that supports the academic goals. And our district does not do OT and PT on a 504.
And
Very
that's
rare, yeah.
fascinating to me.
I work in a very large school district, and we can consult with the regular team and families, but we aren't allowed, well, maybe able is a bad word, to provide direct on a 504. We can help develop it, we can consult, but direct service isn't on a 504.
So I think, what we're seeing is just the diversity of what school districts are able to offer. So having meetings, seeing, okay, even I've seen on 504 plans where speech can be consulted, but it's not seen as a formalized service in the way that special education label would then delineate or send out speech services. So, for our parents out there, I think having a conversation with a teacher, having a conversation with a school psychologist, having a conversation with someone in the special education kind of group at the school is a good place to start exploring what is possible, because it's pretty diverse in terms of what can be offered and what's available. So, yeah, thank you. Yes.
So as we approach the end of high school, we have had people really encourage us to take one more neuropsych eval. And I'm wondering, is there ever a time or a situation where you don't gain additional information? Like, is there a time to stop doing that?
So the brain is certainly developing into the 20s. I think at the point, it really depends on what the goals are, I would say. So if the goals are post-secondary schooling and trying to establish services, if the goals are to kind of update programming, if things are just not progressing in a way that is making sense, or you're needing some extra information, extra guidance, I think that's a good tell to pursue getting an updated evaluation. Pursuing guardianship, for example, is a good reason to get updated neuropsych testing. But to just get it because it's the thing to do, I wouldn't say that makes sense. There have to kind of be some goals or some reasons or some things that you're trying to really answer and unearth and, potentially get access to resources to make it make sense. Does that make sense? Okay. You do one more question? Okay.
I have a question. When you were describing neuropsych testing, it sounded like any individual with CP could participate in that. Is there any research that looks at the percentage of individuals with CP who can actually complete neuropsych testing, given that some individuals are nonverbal or would not be able to do the handwriting?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. So we do have ways of adapting and modifying the testing. For example, we have IQ tests that are completely nonverbal that we would be able to do with children. Certainly, some of the testing would be limited if with motor impairments, but we would be able to do some of it. What I would say would be the best course. We put our hands on every single referral that comes into our service. So having, and we do require a medical referral be made. So having a pediatrician or a nurse practitioner or a primary care doc send over a referral, we'll take a look at the profile and see if we're able to do the testing, and if not, then figuring out how to send the family to somewhere else for next steps to get resources.
Because in my experience as a parent, it seems that the testing can become invalid if you change it or adapt it so much for an individual. And I think it's a huge problem with CP that there aren't tests available for people who are more significantly involved. So that we don't really often get accurate test results in this domain.
Okay. Yeah, and I think certainly because the testing is paper pencil based, we're limited with what we can do. And ultimately, if we're not able to actually do that testing, then going to the place of figuring out what resources to get connected with. But thank you for sharing that experience. I appreciate that.